there doesn't seem to be any physiological tolerance, that the reward is just as great after your 10,000th press as it is your first press. It seems that the brain doesn't have any kind of mechanism for inducing physiological tolerance for pure pleasure. The complication here is that there is quite a lot of evidence that the dopamine system, mesolimbic dopamine system, is particularly implicated in desire and motivation, and the actual substrates of pure bliss reside in the mu opioid system in our two ultimate hedonic hotspots. Now, the dopamine and opioid systems are intimately connected, but it's even been suggested that people have even raised the questions, are wireheads actually happy? Surprisingly few people have actually tried wireheading. There are so-called ethical constraints, and quite a large number of people who have tried it have been schizophrenics. This is Robert Heath's experiments, and we have some reason to think that the dopamine system of schizophrenics may be abnormal. But yes, from the evidence seems to be that wireheading is pleasurable, but it's not the kind of peaceful, serene, opiated bliss. It is a sense of anticipation and desire, as if in 2 minutes' time you're going to be sleeping with Miss Universe or something like that. It's not kind of Buddhist nirvana.
I'm going to ask, I mean, obviously having a hole drilled in your head and an electrode inserted in your brain is a rather complex and invasive procedure. Has anybody tried doing this with transcranial magnetic stimulation?
There is some evidence that transcranial magnetic stimulation is an effective treatment for clinical depression.
It's when magnets are applied in a suitable...
Yes, it sounds like kind of mesmer and...
You don't dig a hole in the brain.
Yes, and it seems, at least in I don't know the latest figures, but some people do derive significant clinical benefit. It's clearly not as targeted as wireheading, but it's not as invasive. I'm stressed that I'm most certainly not advocating wireheading. I'm just covering it as an option. One of the bad arguments against wireheading, I think, is the idea that somehow it's offensive to human dignity. Whereas if you think of the ways in which humans get their most intense forms of pleasure in the bedroom, as I said personally, I think wireheading is probably considerably more dignified, shall we say, insofar as the concept of dignity is useful from that. However, I'm not advocating or predicting wireheading, various reasons. One is that it's not evolutionarily stable. Wireheads don't want to raise baby wireheads. Yes, clearly there's going to be intense form of selection pressure, even if a sufficient number of people wanted to try it. They won't be the ones who are raising and nurturing kids. On the whole, the only people who tend to be really attracted to wireheading are the people who are severely depressed, in which it can actually seem a rather enjoyable prospect. I think it ought to be said that, I mean, none of us have ever tried wireheading, so probably when one uses the word wireheading, one thinks perhaps of this little rat, and one doesn't like to think of oneself as a rat, but possibly if one had actually tried it, one would have a different perspective. One thinks of a small prudish child. I'm thinking of myself when, at the age of 5 or something, my mother explained to me the nature of sex, and I just thought it was yuck. Who would want to do anything like that? I didn't quite understand. I thought pyjamas got in the way, but nonetheless, as human beings grow up, nonetheless, most of them do practice that. And so, in the absence of any knowledge of what wireheading is like, perhaps one is too quick to dismiss it in the way I'm doing. However, yes, as I said, I'm simply using it as an existence proof that indefinite well-being is physiologically feasible. Actually, I've got to qualify that in the case of non-human animals. Most non-human animals will, at least if they're caged, will continue pressing the lever indefinitely until they die of immunological collapse in starvation. Humans, apart from depressed humans, don't tend to do that. They don't tend to compulsively be unable to stop in the way like that. Now, this may, of course, just indicate that most caged non-human animals are, in fact, depressed. Okay, if in terms of getting rid of suffering, we're not going to go down the route of wireheading, there is a possibility of different forms of drugs. Now, there are a current crop of recreational drugs, which clearly the kind of well-being they induce from being stoned from cannabis or cocaine, heroin and the like, unfortunately, all they do is they just tend to cause the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain to kick in. And so, although one can't rule out in future some ideal recreational drug that is self-limiting and doesn't kick the brain's negative feedback mechanisms of gear, I'm not sure that this is the route we want to take. Certainly in terms of getting rid of suffering, do we really want to, for instance, medicate our children from birth? Wouldn't it be better if they were naturally psychologically healthy? In terms of clinical drugs, if one looks at anti-anxiety agents, benzodiazepines, minor tranquilizers, once again they all show a fair degree of tolerance. So-called antidepressants, this has been unfortunately a great scandal. Not merely today's so-called antidepressants pretty mediocre. It seems that so-called publication bias means that in many cases unfavourable trials have been suppressed and much of the existing literature can't be trusted. One of the reasons that today's antidepressants aren't particularly effective is that they are designed with the specific aim of not having so-called abuse potential. Most existing antidepressants target the monoamine system, whereas there is a considerable evidence that people with depression, for instance, melancholic depression, their problem is with the opioid system, and if they're suffering from low motivation, that they have low dopamine function. But as we know, opioid drugs and dopaminergic drugs like cocaine and the amphetamines, they have a great deal of so-called abuse potential. And so one would hope clearly that more effective treatments for clinical depression will be designed, but there is this question of wouldn't it be much better if our default setting were that of psychological super health? One advantage clearly of taking psychoactive drugs is that they're much more fine-grained and reversible. And in principle, in future, you could choose to be hyper-motivated doing your essay or paper or something like that, and then switch to complete relaxation again. But nonetheless, in terms of the different forms of psychological distress, I think it would be far better if our well-being were genetically pre-programmed. Okay. Touched earlier on the reproductive revolution, designer babies. It's just starting. Increasingly, parents, for instance, are choosing whether they want to have a boy or a girl. Now, this tends to be, particularly in the Far East, where having a boy is so much more desirable often than having a girl. And though like you, I strongly disapprove of the sexism involved. You're not doing a kid any favour if a kid is a girl, if your parents wanted a boy. But as well as such things as gender, increasingly the reproductive evolution, parents are going to be choosing the genetic makeup of their future offspring. And even single genes like the comp gene, catechol-methyltransferase gene, variant alleles seem to be strongly correlated with the degree of temperamental optimism and happiness and capacity to experience reward. And flash forward a few decades, imagine if you are a prospective parent, and perhaps you'll still have the option, yes, of just throwing the genetic dice and seeing what happens, or alternatively you could choose the hedonic set point of your future child. You're not worried about any grandiose scheme about getting rid of suffering from the world. You're just thinking about the well-being of your future children. Where would you set the hedonic set point of your future child, assuming it were an option? Now, perhaps you might not want gradients of super happiness, but I think it's extremely unlikely that you as a responsible parent would want to have a malaise-ridden, depressive, anxious child. So I think there is going to be intense selection pressure in favour of happier children. Now, it's not to say that, parents clearly clear about many things for their offspring, at least in the liberal West. Many parents will say, I don't care what my child does in life so long as he or she is happy. Now, not really convinced this is the case, that parents want many other things for their children. In particular, they want their children to be successful. But other things being equal, being happy, it's the winning subroutine. To be happy is to be cool and sexy, whereas to be depressive is to be, a loser or a failure. So even prospective parents for whom happiness is only a minor ingredient in what they want from their future offspring, I think are likely to choose happier variants. One relevant question is are these technologies going to be the prerogative of the rich elite in the West? Well, at first they almost certainly are, but it's the nature of so many of these information based technologies that they will very rapidly diffuse throughout the world, just as not everyone, but the third world now will have their mobile phones and the like. And so, yes, initially the reproductive revolution of designer babies will, be enjoyed by the privileged few, no doubt. I think it will very rapidly spread. Sorry, any questions before I go?
One obvious one that just seems that's just sprung up in my mind is how do you measure happiness? I mean, how do you correlate the alleles with the happiness that you're measuring? Do you just ask somebody on a scale 1 to 10, where are you? Is it as simple as that? There
are behavioural tests one can do of happiness, how hard one will work to gain a particular stimuli. At a neurological level, you can test various drugs which seem to correlate, particularly the density of ligand binding to mu opioid receptors and the like. So it's going to be a combination of behavioural and verbal and neurological. It will commonly be said that how can you measure something like happiness and well-being? that yes, you can have human self-reported happiness, but there's some reason to think that people aren't always